Hello, and welcome back to another exciting tutorial for Maya 2017. Today we're going to start looking at a new block inside of Maya, which is texturing, which is all about creating the colors and the surface detail of the objects that we're trying to make. Now, importantly, I'm starting my scene off today with some 3 little examples of work that we're going to be going through today. But these objects are very low poly and you should have no problem actually building them yourself. So I'm going to basically allow you guys to kind of like set up some basic primitives and work on actually building just very simple crate, very simple oil drum like this over here. And if you need any help on modeling, well, check out the low poly modeling tutorial, which is there where you can learn some of the skills in order to make these objects. But they're very simple, extruded, primitive cube and primitive cylinder, just to turn them into something like that. Now, texturing, you require a lot of photos and images to actually work with most of the time. You end up saving a lot of images as well. I will be giving you some test images so that you guys can actually follow along if you want to, and you'll have some pre-made textures all ready for you. You will need to have some form of editing software, so check the show notes below, download some of the textures that I've already made, and I'll also be showing you where you can find some of your own textures as well. Now, the number one place where we start with texturing is normally with some form of imagery per se. We're trying to make something that might look like wood or might look like metal, and later on we have to decide if that metal is shiny and new or if it's actually old, decayed, and rusty. Importantly, when you're working with textures, the images that you use, they have to be royalty-free, preferably. You can either make your own textures. Your photo camera is basically your best friend in many occasions, but there are plenty of websites online that also offer free textures as well. If I come over here just into Chrome for a second, I'm going to show you a few places where you can actually find free images that are available for you guys to use. Places like Pixabay, which is at pixabay.com, is a great site where people actually post images that are royalty free, which means that you have permission to use them for commercial purposes or any purposes that you like. One of the important things to remember is that you can download images directly off Google, but those images belong to somebody. And if you're using them for commercial work, well, there might be a bit of a problem there because the author of that image always would have the right to tell you that you can't use their work because it's theirs, not yours. And this would apply for textures as well. So we have to start thinking about where we can get some good images to actually work from. And Pixabay is one example of these sites. 3dtotal.com has an entire section dedicated to free textures for 3D artists. And they've got a huge library of high-resolution photography that you can use to start creating textures for your actual projects. Another great site as well is textures.com. They offer, again, many high-resolution images for you guys to actually work with, mostly photography and some other pre-made kind of like 3D assets as well. They allow you to make a free account that allows you to download some medium-resolution images, and you can download like 15 or 7 a day, depending on how large you want these images to be. All of these places are, great sites. I recommend, that if you do use them, we'll kind of like give them credit where credit's due. And also, if you can sponsor them in any way, it's always great to kind of like keep the community kind of like going as well. I've actually taken some textures today from both Pixabay and from 3D Total as well. And I'll be showing you guys where those images are, but they've got a huge variety of stuff over here as well. If we just wanted to go into like a section like clothing, or we wanted to go into household, or we wanted to look for anything like clock faces or stuff like that, you're going to see that people have posted up here loads and loads and loads of, again, high resolution images for you guys to start using as your textures. The other side of what you need in texturing as well is some form of photo manipulation software. Now, for today, I'm going to be using Photoshop, but everything that I'm doing, you're going to be able to see that you could do it in Krita, you could do it in GIMP, you could do it in any piece of software that would allow you to manipulate images. I wouldn't recommend MS Paint. It's a little bit too old school to do the type of photo manipulation that we want to be doing in textures, but you're going to need to kind of like be comfortable doing some work in Photoshop or in some form of image editing software as well today, okay? So it's kind of like a little bit of a broad skill set, but most people kind of like will pick up some Photoshop skills at some point. And if you guys really want me to do a Photoshop tutorial of how to do textures inside of Photoshop, well, that's something that I can do. But there are also other specialist texture softwares as well, like Substance Painter or Substance Designer or Quixel Suite as well. So there's lots and lots and lots of software out there that 3D artists use to actually make 3D software, 3D textures. But importantly, you guys can be perfectly fine just starting out working with Photoshop or something similar. So let's start setting up our first scene over here. And by default, we've got these little gray Lambert shaders added onto all of the objects that we build in Maya. I've got over here some 3D layers over here, so I can just hide some of these objects away because I've set up my scene that way. One thing I always like to point out to people is that 3D layers, they're not the same as Photoshop layers. If I've got this proxy objects over here and I move them up and down in my layer stack by using these arrows over here, you're going to see that it's not like in Photoshop where the layers move what's occluded forwards and backwards. It's not exactly the same as grouping, and I would hesitate to call them a group. It's more like a little collection of objects. So you can select objects inside your viewport and you can add them into a layer, and then you can turn the visibility of this layer on and off, and you can arrange your scenes as well. Another cool feature is that you can also make sure that your layers are non-selectable as well, so you can lock them so that you can have objects that you can't touch inside of your scene by pressing this little button next to the actual visibility button over here. So what I'm going to do, this one over here for transparency and reference over there. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just hide away some of these, and I'm going to be working on a few objects at a time, and I'm going to start off with the most basic shapes over here. Now, when we're going to add textures to objects, we're going to start working with two tools mostly. One of them, which is the hypershade, which you can either find in this button up here, which is nice blue and round, or I can go into Windows, rendering editors, and hypershade inside of there. So we've come across the hypershade before, just in a brief introduction video to Maya as well. But again, all of my textures are going to live inside of this little interface over here. And the other window that we're going to have to use a lot is also going into UVs up here. Make sure that you have the modeling panel turned on over here. And inside UVs at the very top, we've got this other window, which is called the UV editor. I already have something turned on over here, but the focus of the tutorial today is to talk about how can you create very simple diffuse textures and how can we start laying out UVs. And these two processes are critical for you to start understanding how to build textures inside of Maya. So let's go ahead and let's start thinking about, okay, how am I going to add a texture into my Maya scene? Now, importantly, I need to choose some form of a texture that will basically have a shader in here inside of my materials window. And inside that shader, there's going to be a few properties that will allow me to control how that material actually looks. So inside the hypershade, I'm going to create a Lambert shader by writing out the first few letters of Lambert over here, or I could scroll in the options inside of here as well until I find Lambert. And I click on that, and it's going to create a Lambert shader inside of here for me like that. I'm going to change the name of the shader to Crate Matte, and then I'm going to look at the base color property over here. Now, in our introduction tutorial, I showed you guys that you could click on the base color of an object and actually change its color by assigning a color with this color picker over here. Now, this color we normally call the diffuse channel, and that is the base color of an object. Now, importantly, Maya doesn't allow you only to change just a base color based on a little swatch over here. There's also this other property over here, which is this little checker pattern. Now, this little checker pattern allows me to connect another texture to this node over here. So if I click over here, Maya's going to open up a little menu over here to create a new render node. And one of the most popular ones to use is this one that is called File. And File allows me to select any image that is on my hard drive. This can be PNGs, Targas, TIFFs, OpenEXRs, and connect them to my diffuse channel in this case. So I'm going to use one of the textures that I have on my hard drive over here just to kind of like show you guys what it is that we're going to be working with straight away here. And I'm going to choose a little file that I've got over here which is called create original diff for diffuse. I'm going to open this image up over here and you're going to see that the shader ball changes its color and appearance, and I'm just going to change this to a simple sphere so that you guys can see. And now you can see that I have this wood grain image projected onto my sphere. So you can use photographs to add texture detail to your objects. And now if I take the shader node over here, and I'm going to use middle mouse button drag over here to actually add the texture into my scene. I'm going to apply it to the object, and you're going to see that nothing's really changed. The reason for that is that Maya by default has textures turned off, and inside of our viewport filters over here there's this little button next to the lamp that has a little checker pattern to it. If I click on this here, you're going to see that now that texture is projected onto my cube over here. You can also turn this on and off by using the keyboard shortcut 5 and 6 to actually turn textures on and off. So textures on is 6 and textures off is 5 over here. So what we're going to do is just leave my textures turned on over here and have a look at what this image actually looks like. So if I go over very quickly to Photoshop, where I've got this file already open, this is a texture that I have pre-made for you guys over here, and you can find it in the asset pack in the show notes below. You're going to see that this is a very simple image of a wooden crate that I could use to kind of like have displayed on my 3D objects. Again, this is the base color of the object, and it'll do quite a good job of making my 3D scene in Maya look like a wooden little crate. However, the display of this object looks really weird. If I come over here, I can see that I see little bits of the wooden texture, and it doesn't look like it's mapping around the box in a very elegant manner. And the reason for this is that we have another tool set inside of Maya, which is the UV editor. Now the UV editor, let me just open it up again by going to UV editor and clicking on UVs. You're going to see I'm just going to click this little checker pattern option over here, which you guys will probably have off by default. I'm going to open the UV editor and we're going to see this kind of like view where we can see the image that I've just added to my texture and this little kind of like series of squares inside here. Now the navigation in the UV editor is exactly the same as any viewport inside of Maya. Use the Alt key and middle mouse button and you pan. Use the the Alt key and the right mouse button to zoom in and zoom out. The wheel on the mouse wheel works as well. You'll notice as well that if you press Alt and the left mouse button, it pans and it doesn't really orbit because the UV editor is a 2D view. It's like viewing Photoshop in 2D mode, where it's like all of the images which are inside the UV editor are flat. I'm just going to close down the hypershade so that you guys can see what is going on over here as well. And adding an image to an object is not enough. We've got this little crazy world of UVs over here. And what are UVs? Well, a long time ago, some very smart people decided that there was a very good way that you could represent the surface of a 3D object in a 2D space. This box essentially has been unfolded and flattened down by peeling one face of it off at a time. It's almost as if it was a paper model, like the ones that you could make when you were a kid, and you kind of like cut the little shape out, glued together the edges, and you made yourself a little paper puppet or object. This is the same idea. The 3D object that we see here has a flattened 2D version. And if I look at some individual faces over here, I can see that this little triangle over here in the top corner and this little section of the crate is actually being projected into this face over here. So if I zoom into it, you'll see that these look very similar. This is because UVs apply 2D coordinates to 3D positions over here, and that's why they're called UVs. We have X, Y, and Z for our movement inside of the 3D workspace, and the letters that come before that are U, V, and W, which we don't use because it's 2D space. So importantly, our UVs and our 3D viewport are connected together in a very specific way. And Maya has a whole host of tools, many menus up here, and its own UV menus, which actually map most of the tools which are inside this polygon menu over here. You can use either one of them to actually start working with your UVs. So what do I really want to do? Well, I want to have this little texture that I've got here projected in every single face of this cube over here. And to do that, what I'm going to have to do is start working with a selection mode and start using some of the unwrap tools. I'm going to take the UV tools up here, and I'm going to click on the double line, and I'm going to leave them open over here on the side so you guys can see what is going on. And then I'm just going to move this cube into a very tiny corner of my workspace over here. When you're texturing, it's absolutely great to give yourself as much space as possible. If you have multiple monitors at home, it's brilliant just to have one monitor with Maya and the other monitor to have your UV editor and your other tools on the other side. It speeds your workflow up quite a bit. But if you're like me and you're just working with one screen over here, just give yourself as much room as you possibly can. So the first thing that I want to show you guys is that if I right click on an object and I choose any of its component selection modes, like for example faces, if I select individual faces inside of my viewport, you're going to see that it maps to the faces that are inside my UV editor over here. Alternately as well, I can do the same thing here. If I come into face selection mode, by right-clicking on an object here, you can see that I can start clicking on individual faces inside of the UV editor as well. Now, traditionally, we tend to work with another mode in the UV editor as well, which is called UVs. Now, the UVs, if I click and drag over here, they look very similar to vertices, but they're not exactly the same thing. UVs are 2D points in space, and if I move them around by using the Move, Rotate, or Scale tool, you'll see that all of the edges which are inside of the UV editor are connected to one another. It's very easy to confuse one for the other, because if I change to, say for example, vertex mode over here, and I select these vertices, notice that they highlight yellow, but notice that the vertices also are connected to the points of 3D space down here. So if I move this round, you see that I get this very weird type of selection that actually I'm moving these 2 points and these 2 down here as well. And that's not a mistake, that's because of these points, they're connected in 3D space. So importantly, UVs allow me to make a different type of selection and have a finer control over the elements that I'm moving. Don't worry if it sounds a little confusing, it takes a little bit of time to understand how these two things work. The other component that's new as well is what we call a shell. And this shell over here actually represents all of the pieces of these UVs that are connected together. Again, remember when I was dragging the UVs around, everything was moving as if it had been glued together. The shell is the complete component of what we call a UV tile, which is the space inside of this image over here. So this component over here, this shell, is a group of UVs that are connected together. And if I went into, say for example, edge mode over here, selected an edge over here, and looked for my split edges tool over here, which I'm going to look at split UVs over here. If I now turn to shell, for example, I can select a new shell over here, because what I've done is that I've just used a tool to cut my UV shell into 2 different parts. So now I have 1 and 2 shells inside of my scene. So the UVs and the shells are two new components that are specific to when we're working with texturing. And actually organizing UVs is something that takes a little bit of time, but it's an important part of the process in learning how to actually texture things effectively. I'm going to Control Z and go back to having my UV tiles connected, hopefully. So if I go back far enough, there we go, my UVs are all back together in one piece. When we're working with UVs, another important aspect is that we've got this thing that's called the UV tile, which is actually this little square which is inside here. It's much easier to see when you've got a texture applied to it because by default it's gray. I'm just going to turn on this checker pattern over here so you guys can see kind of like I've got this little coordinate system here that tells me that this is UV1, 1 because the value over here is 1 over here and the value over here is 1 over there. Now as we move forward in the tutorial, you're going to see that there's multiple UV spaces, and as I move this shell around, you're going to see that I have multiple UV tiles. Now everything I'm going to do today is going to fit into a single UV tile, actually UV coordinates 1 and 1 over here, but you can create multiple tiles later on, and importantly, working within this space is I have to make sure that all of the textures that I'm using fit inside this UV tile over here. So let's go back to our problem and let's start thinking about how can I get each one of these UV tiles to fit into a single space. Now, in layman terms, I can just go into, let's say, polygon face selection mode, and I could say, okay, I'm going to grab this polygon face over here, go into my UV editor, and inside the UV editor I can actually use the scale tool because the scale, rotate, and move tool work exactly the same as inside of the viewport. But notice what happens here. I could take this one face over here, scale it up, 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 use the move tool, drag it down a little bit over here, and you can see that just by scaling that polygon, that UV face, I can actually add a face over here into my viewport, and it looks really, really, really cool. However, if I look at this from the top, I've created all of this stretching, which again is the thing that drives people mad, because as you move one thing in the UV space, something else seems to move out of place. So beware that, just moving UVs around isn't enough. We need to start using some other tools, which inside the UV editor are the projection tools. Now, the projection tools have many, many, many different little options inside of them. And I'm going to be working with one that's called automatic, another one that's planar, and later on, one that's called cylindrical for the actual cylinder that we're going to work with in just a moment. So this little box over here, each individual face that I have in here, I need to tear it off the main UV shell. Before I was cutting edges, and if I went into edge mode and selected cut split UVs, I could tear this out. But the projection modes have a big advantage, which is if I go into face selection mode over here, and I select my individual face over here, and let's say I use the automatic projection. Just before I use it, I'm going to click on the little box to turn its options on, and I'm going to go into here and just double check that this has been set okay and that I don't have any previous settings. It looks pretty good for me over here. And then I can either press apply or just, project straight away. Okay. Now, as I press project, what happened? I need to do another face selection over here so that you guys can see. Again, now this has automatically placed my face, that one selected face, into the entire space of the UV tile over here. Again, I can do this for any object per se. So if I grab this little face over here, and again, I go into just pressing the automatic mapping tool over here. If I zoom out in Maya a little bit, you should see, where is it? I've got this little thing, which is a projection plane. There we go. And which face am I looking at? Oh, it's the one at the bottom. There we go. Okay. So you see that again, it's moved that individual face that I had selected, and it's made it as big as the UV tile itself. So just by clicking on each one of these faces and actually hitting the G key to repeat the last command, I can take all of the faces that are inside of this object and really quickly unwrap them just by going to, again, G key, select this one, G, G, and G, and in a few clicks, this is the same as pushing the little button over here, I've unwrapped and projected each individual face into the UV tile. So again, you can do this in the UV editor mode. You can do it also here. I can make my selection here and hit automatic, and because I'm selecting a single face, this will work straight away. I'll later on show you how to break up an object using the automatic mode in a slightly more complex way as well. But just as a beginner, this is kind of like really cool for us. So very quickly, just this base color of my box over here, let me go to object mode for a second, you're going to see that that's already going to start making my little cube start looking like an actual crate. Now, the diffuse channel is always really powerful because it gives us a lot of detail in just the color. And if we're adding photographic elements into Maya, well, this is going to start looking fairly good straight away. I can also customize things inside of my views as well. So let's say, for example, if I wanted to change the orientation of this crate so that this little line up, which is going upwards kind of right from left to right, I wanted it to come down in this direction. Well, I can make my selection in my viewport over here because currently all of my UV tiles they're actually piled one on top of another. If I click on one here, I can never be sure that I'm grabbing it, and if I select them like that, they're pretty much going to go. If I grab face selection mode over here and click and drag, you see that I select the entire object like that. So I'm going to grab it in the easiest selection area, which is my viewport over here, and then I'm going to use these rotate tools over here, which are actually going to allow me to spin my text around just like that. Again, this will do it at 45 degrees, so I can just spin this little thing down so it goes up and down like that. I can then come around to another face and see that it goes up like that, and then I can come over here, and let's rotate this one around just for kicks. There's a little problem as well with this, which is that there is kind of like a little bit of a shadow line that I added into the texture over there, and that might give me a few problems down the line, but I'm okay with that. So again, I'm going to make sure that I'm in my face selection mode, and I'm going to use, again, rotate left or rotate right. It works exactly the same. At the click of a button, it just does a 45-degree rotation like that. You can also flip UVs and do mirroring of them as well, just the same way in Photoshop that you can flip horizontal or flip vertical. So again, really simple, really powerful tools, and in just a few clicks I've managed to texture my first object really quickly. It helps once you have a texture tile which is there. Okay, let's start looking at some other ways of doing this as well. So again, UVs are specific to every single object. If I come over into object mode and click on the cylinder over here, you'll see I have a different design for the UV shapes like this. Now, this cylinder over here, I'm going to start using a slightly different approach to this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start using a photograph. And the photograph that I'm going to be using specifically is, if I come over here and I go to File, Open, I found two photographs, which I believe are from 3dtotal.com. Found them quite a while ago. They've been on my hard drive for quite a few years now. If I come over here, I've got kind of like this metallic type of photograph over here, and I've got this kind of like little drum kind of like photograph here as well. Now, one of these specifically is a photograph. It's not an actual texture, because you're going to see that even this guy over here, he fits inside of a little square. The texture that I was using before, which is a finished one that I've edited inside of Photoshop, actually fits into a perfect square. And that's going to give us some interesting problems that I'm going to show you over here in just a sec. So I'm going to apply something that's a photograph that's not been really heavily edited directly into a 3D object. And then I'm going to take this one, which is again not a perfect texture, but again another piece of photographic information. And you're going to see that we can add more than one photograph into a single object over here. And I'll show you how in just a sec. So what I'm going to do first is, with my object selected over here, I'm just going to leave the UV editor open for a second, but I'm going to jump back into the hypershade because I'm going to create a new texture over here. And there's many other different types of textures which exist inside of Maya as well. Lambert is not the only one. There's other ones like, for example, Blinn. And Blinn is similar to Lambert in some ways because it's a very classic type of texturing node, but Blinn has a specular control, which controls the little highlight over here, which if I bring this down and up, you can see that I can make the object more reflective with more specular, or less reflective, like that. If I actually turned its specular color down and the reflectivity down to 0, that's effectively the same as a Lambert shader with a few variations per se, but it'll look again like a matte object. Now this over here, I'm going to call this one drum photos over here and hit enter. Now with this image over here, what I'm going to do is, again, choose an image to apply to this cylinder over here. Now again, this is very simple stuff. We're just applying a photograph, adding it to the diffuse channel, or the color channel as it's called in Maya, and then we're applying it to an object. Now let's do very simply, again as we did, click on the little checker pattern next to color in the texture slot, and then what I'm going to do is come over here, choose a file from the options, and inside the file, if I just happen to click on that, you'll see that there's this little playback button over here just because I tapped inside of the workspace, which is this area over here. If I make that a little bit bigger, you can see these are all the connections that my textures currently have, and we will go into that more in detail next week in the tutorial when we talk about shaders. And I will come over here, choose the image that I want to work with, and it's the top one over here as well. Now, I'm not going to give you these images because, again, I don't own them per se, but you can find, free images on Pixabay and all the other places that I showed you earlier, and find some source images for yourself, download them, and do this part of the exercise. So I'm going to come over here, I'm going to open this image over here. I'm going to choose an object which is not exactly similar, but let's look at this plane over here so we can see the actual texture over here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this drum photos and apply it onto this object over here. And again, we're going to have the same issue that we had with the crate, that the initial display of the texture isn't great. So I'm going to come over here, select this, and in my UV editor, you can see that we're going to have to take a similar approach to what we did before. We need to take these UVs and we need to make them fit onto this UV tile. But because it's a photograph, you'll notice that this has got now some really weird distortion to it. Let's look at this back in Photoshop one more time. So if I come over here to the original picture, you see that it's this very big letterbox type of image. And the problem with using photographs directly off the web is that Maya, and all 3D software to an extent, expects your textures to fit into a square tile like this, because this square tile, again proportions 1:1 in this case, is what makes the texture look pixel perfect. So again, if I zoom into this image really closely inside of Photoshop, why is this square model important? I'm going to zoom in here and hope that you guys can just about see it inside of your views. But images are made out of pixels, and the pixels from a photo image like a JPEG or a PNG or a TIFF is made up of square pixels. To make sure that the resolution of our images are good, Maya is saying to us that it expects that everything that's in here to be pixel perfect, and therefore to be projected on a simple square template like this. It will cause some problems, but it's something that we can work with, and we can kind of, like, in a pinch, you might just be able to grab an image and throw it in. But I'm going to show you some of the problems that you find when you're actually working with images inside of Maya, just like this. So when I'm unwrapping my UVs over here, I have to go back to the UV editor. And again, remember that all of this stuff, if I choose shell, Maya has already taken out these shells over here, and you're going to see that I can select the top shell over here, and I can move it out, And I can take this bottom shell over here and I can move it out as well. Never feel worried about moving UV shells out of this space. We're going to move them back later on. But importantly, sometimes I just like getting things out of the way over here because I'm going to do some manipulations to this thing over here. Now, importantly, this UV shell, I can use a type of projection mapping to it as well. Now before I was using automatic, and actually it was very similar to working with this planar tool as well, because I was taking one plane at a time and projecting it. If the object that I've got is kind of like following a cylinder, if I select this shell and unwrap just this cylindrical shape like this, it's going to now scale this set of UVs to actually follow the shape of the cylinder, which is really cool. Now, when you use a projection like cylindrical, you're going to see that you've got these UV coordinates and this little control at the end of the actual transform gizmo inside here. You'll also see a 3D version of it inside of here as well. So you should see these little axes over here. So if I actually grab these little squares at the end, you're going to see that these work very much like the scale tool inside of the extrude tool or inside of the regular scale tool as well. And if I drag these handles, you're going to see that I can do a scale in the x-axis, and if I wanted to, I could do a scale in the y-axis. Oops, I just grabbed the move component of that. But again, just like with the extrude tool, there's a scale component at the end of it, at the square, and there also is a move component as well, like that. So if I put all of these faces to kind of like fit inside my UV template, when I look at this over here, you're going to see that actually this starts looking nice and round again. This round area over here, if I just push it visually until I make it look almost perfectly round, like that, I'm just going to move this over a little bit so I can demonstrate something a little later on, but as soon as this thing kind of like looks perfectly round, I could get away with just doing a quick job of getting a texture kind of like done like this, so that's very handy. Now, importantly, when you're doing texturing, there's this thing that are called seams. And because I'm working with a photograph over here, you're going to see that as I come to the edge of this object, if I turn into object mode for a second, you see that there's this kind of like seam where the edge of the photograph actually is. Normally inside of Photoshop, we'd actually be building a texture and we'd actually be taking this photographic element to an extent, and actually we'd be blurring out the edges over here and trying to make those seams actually disappear. So when we're using photographs, we'll always have the disadvantage that, you know, their size is going to give us a little bit of an issue because they can be pinching, squashing, and stretching, and also that we're going to have this problem of seams as well. So I'm going to go back to right click and hit the shell selection mode over here. I'm just going to move my my UVs over a little bit just to kind of like hide that seam a little bit. I can also put the seam kind of like in an area where I'm not actually going to see it from the render as well. So those are other kind of like cheap little tricks that you can kind of like put into your work as well. And again, I can kind of like just do something like that so I can see that ring of kind of like little rivets at the top of this over here. Now, I mentioned earlier that we were going to use two textures to actually add kind of like different textures to different parts of the actual object. Now, currently, if I move these UV shells, the top and the bottom shell over here, back into the object, you're going to see that these faces are actually being textured with exactly the same texture that we have here. Again, if I move this slightly off as well, you'll also notice that it still has a texture over here. If I move it 50 miles further away, you're going to see that the UVs, it doesn't matter where it's positioned inside of here, the UVs will always have a texture to that. And that's because Maya in the background, if I turn on this checker pattern, it's actually adding more UV information no matter where it moves. So you can see kind of like it's creating basically a repetition of this checker pattern in this case, which is the same for any texture. So no matter where you place one of these objects, it will actually have the same repeated texture by default. You can configure that to work differently, but there's a simple way of making sure that you guys can actually use different textures with different objects without kind of like setting up very kind of like specific kind of like configurations inside of the UV editor. Before, I was applying textures to an object. But one of the great things about most 3D software as well is that you can apply textures to individual components as well. So what I'm going to do is come into my Hypershade one more time, and I'm going to make another texture over here. This drum photos, I'm going to call this the side, as this is going to be the side of my little barrel over here. I'm just going to do a quick copy and paste over here as well, just to copy the name for later on. And I'm going to make myself another blin material as well. I can actually also duplicate this material as well by pressing Command D or Control D if you're on a PC, and that will create a copy of the shader. Notice that that will have the same properties that I had, which is that it has the specular turned off, it has the reflectivity turned off as well, but you'll notice that there's no information in the color because I'm copying the shader node, not the images that are connected to it. So inside the color, I'm going to click on it. I'm going to go to File over here, and inside File, I'm now going to choose that other photographic file that I had from earlier on. I'm going to go to Open. Now inside here, I've got the texture for the top and the bottom of my oil drum over here. In Photoshop, I might have had to have done some color correction and some other stuff, but I'm kind of like just going very quickly through this as well. So what can I do with this? Now I've got a texture called drum photo, and I'm going to call this top. There we go. It'll also be the same one for the bottom as well, but just to give it a distinct name. One of the things that we can do to apply textures as well is that if I make a selection on any component inside of my viewport over here, and I right click here and I choose Assign Existing Material, now I can choose to assign a material, my top material in this case, to an individual face. If I selected a group of faces, I could also apply a texture to those individual faces like that as well. And you can do this for anything. The interesting thing is that I've got two shader nodes over here. And when I go into my UV editor, you're going to see that it's still projecting my side texture over here. But as soon as I choose the top texture, faces over here, you're going to see that it jumps to show me the new texture that is applied to that face. If I select the bottom, which I haven't applied the texture to yet, it goes back to the original texture that we had over here for the side. So importantly, I can select a component and I can apply a shader or a texture to a specific set of faces if I want to. And I can come over here into Assign Existing Material, Top, and you're going to see that it's going to project this over here. So now I can come into the image over here, kind of like put it in the middle of my scene over here, switch using the keyboard shortcut R to bring up the scale tool, and then I'm just going to scale this up like that. Maybe reposition it a little bit like that. I'm just keeping it in my view over here like that. And again, you can see that here, this isn't the best texture in the world because specifically, I'm not doing any Photoshop work at this minute. I'm going to show you guys how to do some Photoshop work to actually improve your textures in just a second. Okay, so there we go. I have myself a top little texture over here, and I'm going to go into object mode, and then I'm going to look at this from the side as well. Now, this isn't what I would consider professional texturing right now. This is something that beginners sometimes should do just to start learning the tools. It's more important for me at this stage that you guys are comfortable actually understanding how you can select UVs and how you can move and scale and rotate them, rather than if you're making perfect texture work at this stage. But in just a few minutes, you'll see that we've already started creating very simple diffuse textures to our objects, which again, always dependent on where our camera is. This might not be great up close, but if these objects are kind of like just off in the background at a distance, sometimes you don't need much more detail than this in a texture for it to actually be selling. But as we get closer and closer to an object inside of our scene, and if this is in a close-up, you're really going to have to start working into not only the texture detail, but sometimes parts of the modeling as well. So now's a good time to make a little pause and do an increment and save. And we're going to move on to actually working on slightly more complex objects and making slightly more complex 3D UV unwrapping. Okay, so after we've made our basic textures, we can start looking at slightly more complex objects, because the advantage is when you're using the standard primitives is that when I create a box, Maya will create a UV layout for me, and little by little I go manipulating different things until my UVs are correct. However, when you start making more advanced objects per se, if I take this object over here, you're going to see that the UVs here, they probably won't line up with what the object actually looks like. And if I look at this example again, here I've purposefully changed the UVs of this object so that it doesn't really make sense. I've actually taken both of these objects, selected them, and gone into just a planar projection and chosen the best plane possible over here. And then I've chosen apply, and it's kind of like just muddled the UVs up like that, just in a crazy type of way. So importantly, you won't always have perfect UVs as soon as you create your object. As soon as you start modeling, those default templates that exist in here, they no longer work. If I just did a very simple planar projection and you looked at this, it just looks messy and horrible as well, you know, and it's like you could play around with these settings as much as you want, and it would just kind of like not keep looking correct. So the important thing for us is that at one point we have to get comfortable actually building our own UV layout. And we're going to do this first of all with a simple example over here of unwrapping this oil drum to the best of our ability. And then we're going to look at actually making a slightly more complex series of unwraps with this little crate over here. Now again, I'm going to give you guys first of all an example file that we can actually work with to give you guys a little bit of guidance. This isn't the normal way of working things, but just so that you can actually see and follow how to unwrap an actual 3D object, I'm going to give you guys another file for your texturing, which inside here, if I go into open and I look for oildrum.jpg over here, you're going to see that I've made this little texture UV kind of like layout for the actual oil drum. Again, this is a little counterintuitive because normally I would have to unwrap this object, send my unwrapped UV tile into Photoshop, build this layout over here, save the texture file, and then go back into Maya and apply it. I'll do that for the crate, but again, I'm going to use this image over here as a guide to where to place your UVs inside of Maya. So to start off with, we're going to do the same thing that we did last time. I'm going to open up my Maya Hypershade, and I'm going to make a new material. Now again, because I'm not concerned about the reflectivity of the object per se, I could choose a Lambert material, or as this is an oil drum, I'll actually choose just a Phong material over here. Now Phong normally is used for making objects that are really metallic and shiny, so that's kind of like a little counterintuitive to how the rusty oil drum is actually going to look, but for now it's fine. I'll only have to worry about that when I start adding some lighting into my scene, but just to keep introducing you guys to new texture nodes which are inside here as well. And most people should know Lambert, Phong, and Bling right from the start. So if I come over here and I go into my textures, and again I apply texture by going into selecting file, and I look for that oil drum JPEG over here. Again, I'm giving you guys PNGs and JPEGs online just so that they're quick and easy to download. Normally I'd be working with files that have a lot more quality and resolution than that as well, so I'd be using OpenEXRs or even Photoshop files in many cases as well. So I've got my oil drum texture over here. I'm going to make sure that my Phong node is renamed to oil drum, and I'll call this UV. There we go, because I'm going to be using it as a pattern for my UV layout. So I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to middle mouse button click and drag onto the object, and you're going to see again we're going to get that horrible stretching that appears with texturing. Importantly, as with all things with texturing, never be too afraid if things look terrible at the start. They will look better by the end of the process as well. So with this oil drum over here, I'm going to hide my proxy objects over here and just work with this next stage over here. This is a slightly more complex version of the drum that I had before, but I'm going to use all the texture information that I've got to help me actually lay out these UVs. So first of all, let's come over here and let's open up the UV editor. And one of the things that I want to get kind of like into your guys' heads is that when you're building UVs, it's very easy to make mistakes, and you should never really worry about it, because one of the key aspects of this is that you have to be comfortable making mistakes. And no matter what the mistake is, you can always fix things. If I have this over here, and say for example I clicked on the spherical projection, and it kind of like ruined the way that my UVs look, well, sometimes I can Control Z that, or sometimes, I can just go like into a cylindrical projection and just click that and see if that looks better. Again, I can use all of these tools to help me get my UVs kind of like in the place where I want them to actually be, so I can use move, rotate, and scale. So sometimes a little bit of manual adjusting will be necessary over here, but you'll see that the projections kind of like have their use up until a point. Now, if I just did a straight cylindrical projection, I'm doing that cylindrical projection on all of the object. So effectively, the top, bottom, and side is being used with this cylindrical type of mapping over here. And it's a great starting point for us to get everything into the right place. However, I know for a fact that the top of this is going to look just terrible, because if I select any of the faces up here at the top, look what happens. You see that they're kind of like projected into a little line like that. That's because the projection for the cylindrical shape for the top is not really going to help me to actually see these faces. However, it's very handy that we can actually make multiple projections. And what I mean by that is, if I came over here, I've currently made a temporary kind of like cylindrical projection at the top of this object over here. I can do projections based on specific selections in the viewport. So if I came over here, and here's another handy selection tool, which is this little kind of like brush selection tool over here, which if I come over here into Maya, you'll see that I get this little kind of like 3D brush like this. You can change the size of it by pressing B and dragging the size of the brush, just like that. And again, it's left click and mouse button click and drag. And this brush, I'm just going to make it a little bit smaller, will select any polygon faces that I drag my mouse on top of, just like that. So literally I can paint in a selection just like that. If I paint too much, I can use any of the selection tools, or press, can I press Alt and Shift? See, will that select it there? No, it won't. So I'm just going to go back to my traditional selection tool there and just deselect those faces like so. Okay, so I've now selected all of the faces at the top over here, just like that. And again, you can use also ring and loop selections as well, and just click on until I've got kind of like all of the faces of that drum selected. Just keep going around, just keep going around, doing a few clicks like that. I'm kind of like double clicking by pressing Shift as I go along the actual object, just like that. Now with all of these faces selected, I can do a different selection for this part. I can actually take these polygon faces and let's do a planar projection. And in the planar projection options, again, I normally like to turn it into best plane over here, because if you use bounding box, you have to be thinking about, is this the Y plane or is this the Z plane? Best plane normally gives me some good options over here, and I'm going to hit project. Now what happens is all of this has been flattened into a single shell over here, which is really great for me because I can come over here into my shells, select the top of my actual object over here, and I can just tear this shell off to the side over here, and you'll see that I've kind of like made a little shell over here, which is the top of this oil drum over here. So I've got here the sides of the oil drum and the bottom still selected, and then I've got this shell over here, which is the top part over here, just because I did a cylindrical projection to get me started, and then I did a specific selection to actually go ahead and select all of these faces over here. Funnily enough, I can do this with the bottom as well. And again, the bottom's going to be relatively easy for me to do as well. I can use my paint selection tool, or I can use any of the other selection tools as well. I'm just going to make sure that I am in face mode over here. And let me see. Oh, that's because I have all of my faces selected, which is not too handy for me. There we go. Let me just do a quick click off like that. And apologies if you can't see this with the red kind of like texture over here, because it's kind of like mixing up with my selection, which is also kind of like orangey and red. I'm going to use a keyboard shortcut, or I can use a keyboard menu here to go to select and grow my selection over here, which is the greater than key over here, which you can press by pressing shift and period on your keyboard if you're on an Apple Mac, just like myself. And with that selection over there, I'm going to do another planar projection. Notice that whenever I do a projection, it's going to do a projection that fills in the entire UV tile, just like this. And then what I'm going to do is take this over here, and I'm going to move it off to one side, just like that. There we go. Okay, so importantly what I'm doing is that I don't want any of the UVs, currently these shells, to overlap one another when I'm working. So that's separate, that's separate, that's separate. This is the proper way of working. When you have all of these UVs, you're trying to avoid the overlap, unless it's something that's intentional. Like for example with the box before, that all the faces had the same image projected onto them, then overlaps are fine. But as a general rule, you should never really have overlapping faces like that. Now, I'm going to do another little tweak here as well, because there's other things as well that I can do as well. Now, this little section inside of here, it's currently been unwrapped following a plane, but if I come up very close to it, you're going to see that there actually is some stretching happening over here. Let me just go into object mode and turn off the wireframe so that you guys can see. I'm going to really zoom into this area over here. You see that the top looks kind of like nice and cool, and I hope that you can see that on your YouTube videos. But you're going to see that the pixels down here are actually being stretched. So these faces actually have stretched pixels. And again, this is something that we're trying to avoid with UVs. We're trying to make all of the faces of our objects as best as possible have pixel perfect type of projections, okay? So we might have to use some other tools for this. Again, I'm going to use this paint selection tool and make it nice and small like that. Or I can actually do this inside of my UV editor as well. So I'm just going to backtrack a little bit just because I know that I should be showing you guys multiple ways of selecting things. So I'm going to go into one of the move tools, and you'll see that the ring and loop tools also work inside of the UV editor as well. So if I make a selection of a face and double click on the face that I want to get to, it's going to select all the intervening faces straight away. So shift and double click, again, brilliant. I'm going to do shift grow once and then twice to select all of the components which are actually inside of here. And then I'm going to use another projection tool which is slightly more advanced, which is called unfold. And unfold is going to take all of the faces that I have selected, or all of the UVs that I have selected, and it's going to try and flatten it out as if you were pulling kind of like a piece of cloth apart by itself. Now there's an important property for us to make sure is not turned on when we use unfold, which is by default there's this little option called pack. And if I've got pack turned on, pack will unfold every object which is inside of my scene over here. So when you're using the unfold controls, make sure you go into the advanced options and you turn off this pack option, or you'll start seeing some weird changes happening across your scene. I'm going to hit apply just to make sure that that's okay. And this has now unfolded this specific selection over here. Now, if I go to move my selection now, you'll see that it's still connected to the rest of the UVs. And that's because unfold allows me to also keep the position of this kind of like together, just like that. Now, this might be something that I want or something that I don't want. If I want to separate it, I would have to cut these UV edges and move them apart, but I'll do that later in a slightly more efficient way. Now again, Maya's going to give its best guess at how this is going to look. all of the projection tools might give you 80% of your work done, ready for you. But many, 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 many other times, you're going to see that you're going to have to do a little bit of fixing later on by yourself. And as we move into the more advanced options, you're going to see that. If I come over here now into object mode, just deselect, and I zoom into this area over here, even though this is not the correct area, we see that we've fixed that pixel stretching because of the unfold tool over here, which is really, really, really handy. So the next thing I'm going to do is come over here, and I'm going to start positioning these initial UV shells, and then I'm going to look at what are the things that I need to fix. So first of all, let's look at the positioning. I'm going to come over here, select my oil drum, and I'm going to be working primarily inside the UV editor over here, so I'm just going to make it a little bit smaller, and I will leave this over here aside. Okay, nice and dainty so that you guys can see it. There we go. Okay, and I'll make sure that you guys just have a little bit of a view there. What I'm going to do is zoom into this UV tile over here, and you can use F on your keyboard to focus in on things as well if you want to. I want to place the oil drum parts onto these specific parts of my oil drum. And I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to select this bottom face. I'm going to go into shell mode so that I can select the whole shell. And I'm going to move this into this part of the UV tile. Again, I'm using this image as a guide as where I should be placing things. And normally this, again, is just for learning. It's not like you have to make a UV image and then kind of like do your texturing. I'll be showing you how to do that properly in just a few seconds. So that's going to be the bottom of my oil drum over here, and it's going to fit fairly nicely into there. Let's have a look at the top over here, and I'm going to select that UV shell as well because I'm still in shell mode, and it's great to be selecting things in between the viewport and the UV editor. They've done a really good job in Maya 2017 where everything is kind of like working together and connected. It's really, really, really great. So I'm going to select this little oil drum over here like that, and I'm going to rotate it. I could rotate it by using the rotate tool, and I've got this kind of like free rotation mode over here, but because I designed this, I can also go ahead and select the shell and use the rotate tool just like that. Now here is an important part where coming into here closely, I can see that now I've got some UVs over here that I would want to manipulate in a very specific manner. Now, here, if I look at the oil drum, and I might have to just zoom into this for a second, you're going to see that the little hole for the top of the oil drum doesn't exactly match what I see in my UVs. And here's the tricky part, because if I'm making selections, say for example in face mode like this, and I do kind of like a quick little selection just like this, there we go, there we go, there we go. I'll just grow my selection by using the grow keyboard shortcuts as well. If I start scaling this and moving it, you're going to start seeing that I will run into some specific problems. Now let me come into here, there's my scale tool. And if I start scaling this, again, we're going to see that the UVs are moving, they're flowing across the surface just like this. So I need to take this and I need to manipulate it in a very specific manner. So what I want to do is actually cut off the UV edges over here so that these pixels remain the same, and I'm only manipulating this area over here. So I'm going to go into edge mode. I'm going to double click on the bottom of the oil drum kind of like cap over here to do an edge selection just like that, and then I'm going to go into my UV tools. Again, they're available from the menus upstairs as well, and you can come over here and we will choose split UVs. Now I'm doing a cut along here, so this area will now become its own individual UV shell. And I can also see that I'm missing a little shape over here. So where did that go to? Let's have a look over here. Now that I've got a shell, I might have to do a little selection over here. And I think I just did my unfold with a little mistake there. So that's not actually added into my selection. I must have missed it earlier. So I'm going to do a face selection mode like this. And I'll do a ring over here, hopefully. There we go. Double click that. Oops, way too much information. There we go. Let's fix this. I'm going to come into here, ring, ring, and again, just do multiple selections by shift and double clicking like that. So I've selected everything that I've done again with the little mistake that I missed out earlier, and I'm going to do another unfold as well. Again, if you wanted to, you could do a projection to start off with to make sure that it cuts it out automatically. So I'm just going to do a planar projection like that. I'm going to completely ignore what it tells me to do here, and then I'm going to go and do a quick unfold again. Now hopefully that's not going to ruin any of my other textures, because I still have those presets turned off. And again, you'll see that with the tools over here, you could warp and manipulate this as well. The only thing I'm going to do is just rotate this round using the standard rotate tool. And let me make sure that I have my shell selection mode turned on. There we go. So I make sure that I'm selecting the shell, choose the rotate tool just to align it. Can be a little bit confusing sometimes, but there we go, as things flash on screen like crazy. And then we're going to come over here, make this smaller, move it into place. And again, a lot of this stuff is move, scale, rotate, move, scale, rotate. It's the tools we always use. There we go. Brilliant. So I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to make this actually just a little bit bigger, because I want just the top of this to be kind of like that little dark area that's actually there. So everywhere where I've got this black little edge there, I'm just going to add a little bit of a rim there, and I'm going to leave it like this. I'm not going to care if this is overlapping per se, because again, it hopefully should give me a nice look over here. Again, sometimes we just have to turn back to object mode, click off the object, and have a look to see if that actually looks like a cap that exists there. And as soon as we add some lighting and some shading, that is going to look great. So really cool. I've got some other little problems over here. There's some stretching up here, but I will fix that last if we just have some time for it as well. And here on the side, you're going to see that I'm going to have to start manipulating some of the edges which are over here. So if I come over here, let's come up to the top, and you'll see that by default, my unwrapping over here of this phase, it kind of like doesn't exactly match the proportions of this over here. Now, there's a few ways of fixing this. Ideally, I wouldn't want to manipulate this too much, but because this is quite a simple thing to fix over here, and I'm not kind of like going into a huge amount of details, I'm going to click and drag to make multiple selections of the UVs of this object over here. And then I'm just going to move these UVs upwards over here until they kind of like fit onto the actual texture that I have over here, just like that. And if you need to manipulate this a little bit because your model is ever so slightly different than mine, remember that you can use the scale tool, and scaling on one axis here becomes very, very, very useful as well. You'll notice that this part here is not going to be kind of like pixel perfect anymore, but there's always a little bit of leeway that you have as well. You know, as much as you can have just a little bit of stretching, you really want to try and avoid it as best you can. But in this case, you know, this is going to be unavoidable because I made the texture kind of like first, and I did the UV layout later. Okay, so again, that's working backwards, but that's just for demo purposes. So what I'm doing is just allowing you guys to kind of like use these edges over here as a guide for where all of these little UVs have to go, just like that. And you see that, you know, just by putting them roughly in the right place, you've got most of your work done for you. There we go. Using UVs should always be kind of like a little bit tedious because you have to be zooming in and looking at things in a little bit of detail like that. But in just a few clicks, again, I've moved these edges by doing multiple selections in UV mode, and you'll see that, hey presto, there is my oil drum. Again, with kind of like a little bit of shading on the sides to actually allow me to kind of like see the edges just a little bit better. Now, there's more things that we could fix, but this is kind of like a bottomless pit to an extent. You know, you can just keep adding detail again and again and again and again. And even if I came over here into face mode and I just did a quick selection of the top of this oil drum over here, and maybe I'll take like the second loop as well, I could take these guys over here, and again, they kind of like fit into a flat plane at the top. I'm just not capable of seeing the detail from the angle over here. Again, if I notice that my UVs, zooming into them, you see that that top face is kind of like at the top over here? Well, I should have probably come over here, and I should give it another planar projection again. And the planar projection is going to guess that this is the best angle for this to be placed at, and I'm going to position this somewhere around here as well. Okay, now if I wanted to be very precise, I could be sewing things together as well, but I will show you guys how to do that in my next example in just 1 second. And then we're going to have some fun at the end where I'm going to show you some other tools which will allow you to do these processes a way lot faster as well. So there we go. just going through manually, one step at a time. I'm going to scale this roughly so that it fits inside. Again, I've got to look at all the areas like that. Again, apologies that I've got like an orange display for my UVs over here, but I'll just select them into shell mode over here so that when I make the selection, you can see that what I've done is that I've fitted my UVs into this area over here as well. And this is here. There's a little bit of overlap, but as they're not directly connected, that's not going to be a problem. Okay, so again, now as I come out here, you're going to see that I've got this reflective Phong material with this diffuse texture over here of this oil drum over here, which you can see a little bit of the glint inside of the highlight over here. So I'm just going to focus on this object for a second, and you should see that here we've got a fairly good representation of this. There's a little bit of a seam over here as well, which I would have to go into Photoshop and do some fixing over here to make sure that that disappears. But importantly, we can see that we've got kind of like a nice little simple texture as well, just by adding, again, the UVs in the correct place. The important thing about this exercise is that the UVs, at the end of the day, all fit inside of one single UV tile like this. And that's very much how we have to think about placement of UVs. They all should fit inside a specific space, because this is all the space that your scene can have for actually adding kind of like pixel perfect textures. Now this texture that I made here is 1,000 pixels by 1,000 pixels roughly, and its purpose is very much to give us the idea of where we should be laying out our UVs. In the next example that I'm going to show you, this box over here, we're going to take this object over here and we're really going to smash it into 1,000 pieces, and we're going to build a UV tile that then we're going to send into Photoshop, which is the proper workflow. But here we've been learning about how to use the different projection modes together, how to move, rotate, and scale things, and introduce handy tools like the unfold tool, which is really handy for actually creating our little layouts just like this. So we're going to make a little pause here in the tutorial, because after editing it, I've seen that this has gone way too long, and it's almost getting over the 2-hour mark to explain all of the concepts inside of Maya's UV editor. So I'm going to break this up into 2 parts and publish part 2 next week, where I will be going over more of the tools that we've been using this week, but especially kind of like unwrapping objects and sewing the UVs back together using some of the tools inside of the UV editor, moving that UV layout into Photoshop and actually showing you guys the power of creating your own textures following these layouts inside of Photoshop, and also going into some of Maya's bonus tools to allow you to unwrap your objects in a slightly more intuitive way, which Maya can do fantastically well as well. To finish off, I'd like to thank as well everyone for the comments that they've been giving on the site, both of just general hellos and also people suggesting topics for future videos as well. I hope to have time to actually address all the questions that you guys have as well. I do want to do a video on lots and lots and lots of subjects. I know that people are really chanting for some V-Ray tutorials that I'm getting ready, hopefully for you guys very soon. And general thanks for staying in touch and kind of like just letting me know what you guys think about all this material. So with that, we finished for part 1 for this week. I'm looking forward to see you guys for next week for part 2. And until then, keep practicing, keep learning more stuff about 3D, and I look forward to seeing you guys next week. Take care. Bye-bye. Okay, so just pause the video there for a second just to finish off this final tile over here. Very much just by going in, fixing it one edge at a time because it was jumping all over the screen. And now I end up with, again, some major shells inside of my UV template over here. And what I want to do is piece them back together so that they actually form kind of like one single shell. So I'm going to take all of these guys and I'm kind of like going to glue them together. And I don't have to be very specific at this stage in terms of how they look, but what I'm going to do is come into edge mode over here, select an edge over here, and again I'm going to do a move and sew one more time over here to connect these two pieces together. Now you can unwrap a cube in many different ways, but again I'm going to do a similar layout to how it looked like inside of Maya. Now I'm going to come over here and just make it purposefully different because I sometimes find that people go kind of like take things a little bit too literal and think that, you know, everything has to look exactly the same as in Maya. And I just want to make this kind of like little cross kind of like going across like that so that you guys are clear that this is a new image. It's not the same image as what we were working with before when I was doing my UV unwrapping on my box. So here we go. And one of the things I'm paying attention to as well is making sure that my UVs are actually inside these areas as well. Sometimes specific game engines or specific kind of like productions will require you to not have your UVs right to the edge. Moving things to ZBrush and Mudbox sometimes requires that as well. So if I come over here, I've now created a UV layout, and inside my viewport I should be checking as well that all of these little checker pattern grids are kind of like square and proportional. So these look like they're the same size as the ones on the top, which are the same size as the ones on the bottom over here. Sometimes we have to fix that manually. And then this thing over here is going to be the basis for my UV template. And a UV template is going to give me the image that I require to actually use in Photoshop. So to show you what this looks like, if I come over here into polygons and in here in the menus, because it won't appear in the UV tab, inside the UV editor at the bottom over here, you're going to see that I've got this thing called a UV snapshot. Now this is going to render effectively the contents of my UV editor over here, and it will ask me to choose a type of file that I wish to use, and I will come over here and I will choose something that is flat, like a JPEG, hopefully, that has no alpha channel to it as well, because if you save it sometimes as a Photoshop file or a file that supports an alpha channel, it's actually going to put an alpha channel inside of Photoshop as well, and that will lead to some interesting results later on. And what I'm going to do is make a 1024 by 1024 size image, and then I'm going to choose where it's going to render out, which by default should be to my images folder inside of my Maya project, and anything that you render should appear inside of the images folder. So I've got all of this here, and it gives it a name by default called out UVs, and I'm going to call this crate underscore UV, just like that. Okay, now I've got this all set up inside of my scene over here, so I'm going to press OK over here, and it will render out the actual normals here. Again, one of the things that it's just told me is that I have to have an object selected in order for it to render out. So that it doesn't freak out, I'm going to hit over here, select my object in object mode, press OK, and now it's rendered out my crate UV.jpg. So now if I go into Photoshop, we can open up that file and see what we got.